The play now, taps, and then we'll have a minute of silence.
Eulogy in memory of Private Daniel G. Callahan. Renowned American writer William Faulkner once said, "Man will not merely endure, he will prevail. He is immortal, not because he alone among creatures has an inexhaustible voice, but because he has a soul, a spirit capable of compassion and sacrifice and endurance." These words ultimately embody the indelible legacy left by fallen soldiers who suffered as a result of a cruel and perpetual war. However, commemorating a fallen soldier is not simply achieved by defining their awards and terms of service. Rather, it is a privilege, an opportunity to recognize the perils they encountered, the camaraderie they solidified, and the sacrifices they made for the restoration of global peace. Sacrifice, a concept whose meaning has essentially become diluted with its frequent association with mass destruction and warfare, should not be regarded as a mere death on the battlefield. It is the abdication of one's own life to defend a greater cause. During the Second World War, more than 400,000 American soldiers were slain mercilessly at the hands of a brutal enemy on foreign soil. However, such a considerable loss of human life should not be interpreted as a number. These men did not willingly surrender their livelihoods on distant shores to be remembered by future generations as a statistic. Ultimately, each fallen soldier should be venerated as an individual hero whose unwavering audacity allowed for the preservation of America's freedom. One of these heroes is David G. Callahan, a young man who epitomizes the elements of patriotism and sacrifice. Mr. Callahan was born in Boston on December 7, 1921, and was adopted by Mr. and Mrs. George E. Johnson of Stoneham, Massachusetts. Callahan graduated from Stoneham High School in 1939 and attended college for 2 years. From 1940 to 1941, at the age of 20, he worked primarily as a farmer, and in 1943, he was employed at a rubber factory, eagerly assisting the war effort like many of his fellow patriots on the home front. He was also a devoted husband. Mr. Callahan enlisted in the U.S. military on November 16, 1942, in Boston, alongside his 3 brothers, Arthur Palos and Charles J. McIntyre, both adopted sons of the Johnsons, as well as his biological brother, John E. Callahan. While it is a terrible tragedy to lose a child, it is also a great honor to have multiple sons readily embark on a crusade for universal liberty and democracy. Naturally, the Johnson brothers truly exemplify the American spirit and fervent dedication that propelled the Allies to eventual success. By enlisting and serving together, they forged a unique bond, an unparalleled comradeship that can only be found among the tattered, battle-hardened soldiers of war who are tirelessly fighting to maintain our ultimate freedom. Following his entrance to the military service, Mr. Callahan was stationed at Camp Maxey and Camp Swift in Texas for several months before being sent overseas in March of 1944. Once in Europe, he became a private first class in the infantry battalion and served as a machine gunner for the 26th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division. On the night of June 6th, his regiment was summoned to supplement the depleted Allied forces who had suffered devastating losses on Omaha Beach earlier that morning. The following day, on June 7th, despite relative calmness, enemy fire suddenly descended upon the troops. Although there were slight casualties, Callahan was one of only 10 men to be killed in action during an attempt to liberate the town of Formany. He was awarded a Purple Heart for his valiant service. Ultimately, Mr. Callahan and thousands of other men lost their lives at a young age. However, their heroism and bravery will always be imprinted on the hearts of the American people. The nation itself would not be in existence today if not for the exceptional perseverance and tenacity of every soldier. Although they are no longer with us today, their memories will live on eternally, and we are forever grateful for their loyal service and selfless sacrifice.
Percy Zimmerman rests here at the request of his wife Jeanette and younger brother Blaine, a place that is peaceful and well cared for, a place where his service is respected. Percy was a young man of strong character and a natural leader. He captained his high school track team to a state championship after high school. He organized and left a softball team that rarely lost when Jesse Owens came to town. Pat put his spikes back on to represent Monroe and beat the Olympian with the aid of a 5-yard head start. The Army saw that Percy was not only hardworking, but had the skills to bring men together. In England, he earned rapid promotions. He had no illusions about the challenges that faced him. He urged his brother to do his best to get himself reassigned to a heavy weapons company, so he was a little further from the front. On D-Day, Percy was part of the 29th Division's floating reserve, which was to follow the assault waves and expand the beachhead. His regiment landed near Vierville-sur-Mer on the offensive of June 8th while leading a section of his platoon to destroy a German radar station. Sergeant Percy Zimmerman was killed. His wife Jeanette learned of Percy's death on the anniversary of the 28th, their first anniversary. Pat, I remember your sacrifice, and you will never be forgotten.
Lieutenant Leroy E. Jacobson was once just a name to me, and I'm so glad that he is now so much more in my eyes. However, it makes me sad to know there are so many men like Jacobson who remain silent heroes, who deserve to be recognized. But this is a start. I feel as though through this program I have come to know Jacobson, which is bittersweet, something I'm sure all of you have experienced as well. Jacobson was born in Canada but fought for the United States, which became his home and where he planned to continue his life after the war. Not much is known about his upbringing due to his immigrant status, but he attended the University of Washington for 3 years before the Great Depression struck, and he enlisted in the Army shortly after Pearl Harbor. Despite being injured, Jacobson refused discharge. His wife, who would later destroy all photographs of him because of the pain they brought forth, drove down to San Diego from Seattle to nurse him back to health. Absolutely nothing would stop Jacobson from fighting for our country and our world. He landed on H+1 minute, 6:31 a.m. on Omaha Beach, June 6, 1944. As if this weren't already the most unfavorable set of circumstances imaginable, E Company lost their radio communication and many of their weapons were jammed with sand. Some boats sank, some men drowned, and others saw many of their men lost from enemy or even friendly fire. We still do not know exactly what happened to Jacobson, but that doesn't matter. We know what matters. He fought for a country that wasn't his first home, and he stopped at nothing to do so. And as a platoon leader, he encouraged his men to go on, even though he eventually could not. As I mentioned in my leadership talk yesterday, leaders set examples for others. When leaders fall, others must take initiative and must learn from previous examples. I am certain that Leroy Jacobson's sacrifice is not in vain. His family's sacrifice was also not in vain, and I am incredibly grateful and forever indebted to them as well. Ed Jacobson was born just 3 weeks after his father was killed. To this day, he is distraught over not having had a father to play catch with as a boy. It is so hard for me to stand here before you and say this had a purpose, but that is how we must view it, and how Lieutenant Leroy Jacobson would have wanted us to view it, no matter how difficult it is to understand. I will never forget the sacrifice Jacobson and his family made and continue to make for me.
Joseph Lyndon Page was a beloved son, brother, friend, and a truly heroic man who I spent several months researching. The moment I selected Joseph Pish as my soldier, I found myself spending hours reading about him. As I dug deeper, I felt a connection, or a bond growing between us, due to the similarities in our life. We both grew up and were raised in Florida. He lived 3 hours from my front door in Homestead, Dade County, Florida. Just like I am 17, Joseph was also 17 and looking forward to the life ahead of him. Unfortunately, his life was cut short due to his heroic actions. I am sad to say I never got to meet Joseph, but I will always look up to him as if he was my older brother. This is why the day he passed away, July 17, 1944, will not only be a significant day in his family and friends' life, but a significant day in my life. Joseph Pish was fresh out of high school when he joined the Air Force, as were many of the young men who joined the military at this time. He enlisted in the Air Force in 1940 and gave the last 4 years of his life to fight for our freedom and safety. He became a first lieutenant in the U.S. Army Air Force and was part of the 509th Fighter Squadron, 405th Fighter Group. He fought hard for his country and gave it everything he could. Like many men fighting at this time, he most likely never saw himself as a hero, rather a normal guy fighting for his country. Today we are here to honor him because he is a hero to me, to his family, to his friends, and to everyone who is living today because of his actions. His hard work was honored with a distinguished Flying Cross, an Air Medal, work was honored with a Distinguished Flying Cross, an Air Medal with 7 oak leaf clusters, and a Purple Heart. Joseph Pish was a pilot of the P-47 Thunderbolt. On July 17, 1944, he was returning from a bombing mission over Lee Mins when he was hit by AA fire, wounding him severely. He tried to land, but soon lost consciousness, resulting in Joseph hitting a tree. This caused the plane to crash in flames. I often wonder what his last thoughts were. Was he thinking of his family, friends, those he left behind, or the life he could have had? Joseph sacrificed his life for the people of his country. Most you would never know nor meet. However, it did not matter whether he knew every single person he gave his life for. He still gave up everything for the greater good of our nation. At the age of 17, he left behind his mother Fern, At the age of 17, he left behind his mother Fern, his father Thomas, and a younger brother Judson, in a town full of friends and acquaintances. I believe his family was scared when he joined the Air Force, but I am positive at that moment they realized what an amazing son they had. If a man such as Joseph, at the age of 17, can decide that giving his life to save hundreds of others is more important than his own, it is truly inspirational. I do not personally know any other man than Joseph Pish who would give up every living moment at such a young age. I believe we all have something to gain and learn from the brave actions of this man. Joseph Pish, there will not be a day in my life that I will forget you. You are the bravest 17-year-old I will ever know. You have truly inspired me to want to do better for my family and country, and that I do not have to wait until I am older to accomplish such things. You gave your life to protect us. Whether you thought it or not, you are a hero. When the world was at a time of need, you were right there to save it. You will always be a hero in my heart and to those who know your story.
We are here today to honor the memory of John Alden Chapel. On July 28, 1944, John was a 20-year-old cannoneer in the 30th Infantry Division, 119th Regiment, when he was killed near St. Lo defending his country and assisting in the liberation of France. What an honor it is to stand here today and reflect on John's life and his contributions to the invasion of Normandy. John grew up in the Boot Heel of Missouri in a small sharecropping community known as Parma. He was known for his good looks, his great smile, and talented musical abilities. He sang, played the guitar, and the French harp. John was also known for writing his own music. When John finished the 8th grade as valedictorian of his class, he went to work on the farm, hoping to bring in crops to support his family. John was a hard worker and had a bright future ahead of him. Along with being engaged to be married, he had joined the Civilian Conservation Corps in Iowa just before he was drafted by the U.S. Army. In March 1943, John became the 3rd generation of Chapel men to have served. His grandfather, Wyatt Jackson Chappell, was a Civil War veteran fighting as a Tennessee volunteer for the Confederacy. His father, John Allen Chapel, served his country during World War I. 3 of John's brothers also have served their country during World War II. 2 served in the Air Force and 1 in the U.S. Navy. John left behind his father, 6 brothers and sisters, and his fiancée, Ina Cox. He was preceded in death by his loving mother, Curly. John and his mom had a very close relationship. Before John was drafted, he could be found listening to the radio, dancing and singing to the songs of the Grand Ole Opry together. John was awarded the Purple Heart with Oak Leaf Cluster for his service and sacrifice. Even though Miss Allison and I never got the chance to meet him, I know I speak for both of us when I say he is our hero and will live on forever in our hearts. John's sister Lou has never been able to make the trip to pay her respects to the older brother who she remembers so fondly. Lou asked us to look at his grave for her and to pay the respects that she never had the opportunity to do. We are humbled to take a moment to do so. The Bible verse John 15:13 reads, "Greater love has no one than this, that he lay down his life for his friends." We recognize the honor and the valor that he showed on the battlefield, and the love for his country and family. May the memory of Private John Alden Chappell rest with all of us.
He is a man of courage who does not run away, but remains at his post and fights against the enemy. Socrates. On June 6, 1944, young American boys, who were barely out of their teenage years, became men of courage. Steadfast in their resolve to protect our rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, these men gave the ultimate sacrifice on that fateful day. Staff Sergeant Maurice Miller Williams is one of those fallen heroes. Born on August 28, 1917, Maurice came into this world in the wake of World War I. Born and raised in Fairfax, Virginia, his early life was very rural. Both of his parents, Howard Williams and Leah Cornell, were dairy farmers, so Maurice grew up in a very rural setting. The youngest of 12 children, Maurice grew up in a family that had a history with the U.S. Armed Forces. His brothers, Virgil and Alan, both served in the U.S. Army in World War I, and his grandfather served in the Confederate Army during the Civil War. Throughout his time in Fairfax, Maurice made a name for himself quite quickly. He pitched for both Oakton and Fairfax high school baseball teams, a talent that would follow him to his posting in Great Britain. He was an honor roll student, taking part in many extracurricular activities, such as student government and vocational clubs. After high school, he went on to become a detective in the police force, thus beginning his career of public service. When I read all about his high school and youth endeavors, I realized that Maurice was a person who would want to help others rather than help himself. He showed true character, honor, and leadership throughout his entire time at Fairfax. He made it a better place to live. On May 7, 1941, at 24 years of age, Maurice enlisted into the U.S. Armed Forces. Assigned to A Company of the 116th Infantry Regiment in the 29th Infantry Division, he reported to Fort Meade, trained at North Carolina, Cape Henry, and Camp Landing. His assignments differed from that of others. He pitched for the 116th Yankees as well, winning the European Theater of Operations World Series in 1943, along with his teammates and fellow servicemen. In a time of unending war and chaos, Maurice and his teammates brought smiles to faces that were blackened by dirt, gunpowder, and the horrors of war. On the historic day of June 6, 1944, Maurice and his company were called upon to aid the world's largest amphibious land invasion. He came on the HMS Empire Javelin, along with many of those that we know as the Bedford Boys. As part of the first wave, he was crucial to establishing a foothold on Omaha Beach that the Allied troops may have sprung off of, including the capture of Vieirville Draw. Unfortunately, in the midst of all this chaos and artillery fire, Staff Sergeant Maurice Miller Williams made the ultimate sacrifices on the beach of Normandy. I continually tried to comprehend what had gone through his mind as he landed upon the shores of Omaha Beach. Maurice shows us that the actions of one man alone can never be underestimated. He showed strength in the face of great adversity. Standing at the hallowed grounds of where he fought, where he died, and where he is buried has made me realize that his experience in this war was all too real. Today we have all come here not only to honor and pay tribute to the actions of such a courageous man, but to remember that the freedoms that we enjoy are not to be taken for granted. Maurice, you may have fallen, but you will never be forgotten. In the words of Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, they fought together as brothers in arms. They died together, and now they sleep side by side. To them, we have a solemn obligation.
United in this determination and with unshakable faith in the cause for which we fight, we will, with God's help, go forward to our greatest victory. General Dwight D. Eisenhower. The sacrifice that Floyd Elgin Osborne made for his country was saddening, but he was willing to make it. He the United States was supporting her allies against Nazi Germany because the Nazis wanted to dominate Europe. Freedom, a cause that many fought for, was being threatened not only with our allies, but in our own country as well. We saw it as our duty to help them in their time of need. Lloyd Osborne was one of the men fighting for freedom because he wanted to protect his country and other countries from those nations that wanted to destroy them. Lloyd was born on October 12, 1917 in Breckenridge, Colorado. His parents were Malcolm and Marguerite Osborne. He had 4 siblings, Marguerite and Vance, who survived him, and his brother Claire and sister Jerry, who preceded him in death. His brother Vance also chose to serve his country during World War II with the Radio Signal Division. When Floyd was in high school, he played basketball, and he always had a respect for the law because his uncle Jerry was county sheriff and his uncle Harry was the town marshal. Floyd never had the opportunity to marry and was only 26 years old when he died. One of Floyd's passions in life was his love for traveling. He had been to 38 states and 6 European countries. While traveling in the U.S., he finally settled down in Miami, Arizona, to follow in his father's footsteps to become a miner. Floyd worked with the Miami Copper Company and was provided housing from the company. Floyd lived in Miami for about a year when he decided to enlist in the Army on April 3, 1942. He volunteered to become a paratrooper and was with the 101st Airborne and 502nd Parachute Regiment. It was very brave of him to become a paratrooper because it was so dangerous and it was untested in warfare. Floyd seemed adventurous and free-spirited. He probably got a sense of excitement when he flew through the air. On January 17, 1944, Floyd wrote a letter home from England to his parents telling him how he was doing. He wrote about when he made his 12th jump on December 20th and how he got to tour England from the air. Floyd was a paratrooper in D-Day and was injured before he reached the ground. He succumbed to his injuries on D-Day +3. One of Floyd's friends, who was a member of the same platoon, said, "I regarded him as one of the finest men I have ever worked with. His conduct on the field of battle was outstanding. Floyd was someone that others could depend on when they needed him, and he received the Purple Heart for his service. Although I never knew Floyd, he seemed like he was a kind person. When I went to the airborne simulation in St. Mary Glees, I could hear the loud engine and the shots that were being fired from below. I felt frightened, like they were frightened while they were sitting there waiting. Every soldier sitting there was scared because they were jumping into complete darkness, and for many, it was their final jump. He sacrificed his life so our allies could be free, and he also helped protect our freedom and way of life. Floyd's story was once silent, but there is now a voice and a story attached to it. Thank you, Floyd, for your willingness to fight and to protect our freedom. Thank you for aiding our allies, and thank you, Floyd, and thousands of other men for making the ultimate sacrifice for our country."
What does it mean to be a soldier? To be one who fights for their people's safety, for their country, for the benefit of those around him? What does it take to be a soldier? Bravery, courage, honor? All of those things are what made up John and all of our silent heroes and every single person resting eternally in this cemetery and those all over the world. The act of being a soldier is not an easy one. As I have spoken to and gotten to know many veterans, I have come to slightly grasp but will never understand what those men went through. When defending your country, there is a tremendous amount of pressure put upon you from your commanding officers, civilians, and most of all, yourself. Every single one of the men buried here, everywhere, and every single veteran gave everything they had to end a war, and I have the utmost respect for all of them. John was born and raised in Mahoning, Ohio, and was part of activities in his high school such as a play, hallway monitoring, as well as other things. Little did he know that he would be fighting for his country in the Second World War and dying on one of the most important days in history. John enlisted for the Army and volunteered to be a paratrooper. He trained at Camp McCall and Fort Benning to become part of the 82nd Airborne's 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment. He was in the 1st Battalion in Company C and served his country with his brothers in arms and died beside a tremendous amount of them. John fought with the 508 Red Devils around Lafayette and missed his drop zone and got lost. His death was one of about 1,500 paratrooper casualties. John was buried temporarily at Blasville on June 15th. However, now lies here in this very grave where he can be honored properly for his service. He gave the ultimate sacrifice for our freedom. John was obviously not the only hero in this war. These men all contributed not to just our liberty, but the freedom of entire countries. I felt a personal connection with John because he had a few of the same interests as myself. When I think about what he did for me and what all of these men did, I get choked up. When I see veterans who invaded with these same men, telling stories of their buddies and how they died, I can't help but be in awe. I will never know and will never understand what they went through to preserve the life of our country. The amount of respect I have for these men is monumentous. Keeping a country free takes much more than we all realize. Freedom is not free. People say that quite a lot, but I don't think the people who hear it are listening. Freedom comes with a price. Look around you. These men were the price. They became the currency of war and were exchanged accordingly. This is something we can never get back. These men are something we can never get back. With the few that we have left, we need to realize what they did for us, because these men here cannot tell us their stories. They truly are silent heroes, and we are giving them something they weren't able to have, a voice. We are their voices. We are their representatives, and we can never forget that. John was truly a silent hero. No living relatives, no dependents, no living trail. I am his voice. I am John's advocate. We are here today to honor them, and we wouldn't even be here if it weren't for them. Men such as John, who will never be able to share with his grandchildren how he earned a good medal, a good conduct medal, or how he hated the Germans, or how bad the food was. John will never have that. John is laying here, and only he knows what he went through. Veterans are dying every day, but John never got the chance to be a veteran. All men gave some, but these men gave all.
Sergeant Albert Prescott. In the poem, "The Young Dead Soldiers Do Not Speak," the poet writes, "We leave you our deaths. Give them their meaning." Today, I am here to speak on behalf of Sergeant Albert Raymond Prescott, who was born in 1918 to Charles and Lillian Prescott in the rural Iowa farming community of Sac City. He was the oldest of 4 children. His younger siblings included 2 brothers, Harold and James, and 1 sister, Pauline. His mother died when Sergeant Prescott was only 5 years old, and he had to help raise his brothers and sister. He spent most of his time living near Sac City. He married Dorothy Wagner of Hinsdale, Illinois, who gave birth to 1 child that never got to meet its father. His brother Harold followed in his footsteps and joined the fight against Germany. Sergeant Albert Prescott was not drafted. He enlisted in the Army on April 29, 1942, in East St. Louis, Illinois. He volunteered to the 82nd Airborne Division, 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment, known as the Down-to-Earth Boys. He received his paratrooper training at Fort Benning, Georgia. When the 507th Regiment went to the United Kingdom, Sergeant Prescott and his regiment were first placed in Northern Ireland, and arriving in Nottingham, England, to prepare for the Allied invasion of Europe. On the morning of June 6, 1944, Sergeant Prescott jumped out of his plane and parachuted into the Normandy countryside. Albert must have felt anxious leaping from an airplane and plummeting to the ground. He survived the landing to fight on throughout the rest of the day. His objective was to help secure the port of Cherbourg. Albert fought along with his regiment until D-Day +8. On June 14, 1944, Albert personally set up a machine gun at a strategic crosspoint under heavy enemy small arms and artillery fire. He valiantly remained at his position. He kept the machine gun firing, killing 3 Nazis. His action forced the remaining German defenders to retreat, and Albert's own platoon to advance. Later that day, he left his covered position and was fatally wounded carrying an injured brother in arms. His body was temporarily buried in the farmfield-turned-cemetery of Blossville. He is now permanently laid to rest here. This marker represents the sacrifice of Sergeant Albert Raymond Prescott. For his devotion, he was awarded the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, and the Purple Heart. Albert exemplifies sacrifice for freedom because he enlisted to help liberate the people he never met. All of our soldiers used to be silent heroes, but because of the Normandy Institute, they are no longer silent. Their stories have been brought to light. Together, we are helping our soldiers' lives gain the meaning they deserve.
The soldier, above all other people, prays for peace, for he must suffer and bear the deepest wounds in God's war. Said U.S. Commander General Douglas MacArthur, as he succeeded in lending it into the Korean War. While words can never fully express how much someone means to us, it can still provide us comfort, solace, hope, and even inspiration following the death of a brave young man. Emile Tinguay was born in 1919 to Canadian immigrants Wilfred and Aslan Tinguay. His Catholic, French-speaking family lived on St. Joseph Avenue in the French-Canadian section of Fitchburg, Massachusetts, and Claghorn. Emile had an older sister, Rita, a younger sister. Emile had an older sister, Olive, a younger sister, Rita, and a younger brother, Robert. He attended St. Joseph's Parish Grammar School and Fitchburg High School. As a youth, Emile was involved in diverse activities before joining the military. He played bugle in the Guy Fawkes Lawn Guards, played second base for the Fitchburg Rangers, and he managed the St. Joseph's Club baseball team. He was employed as a finisher by the Arden Mills of the American Women Company. Like many patriotic young American men, Emile Tinguay enlisted in the National Guard in January of 1941 as Hitler was trying to establish the New World Order. Emile received his basic training at Camp Edwards on Cape Cod. In April of 1942, Emile and 6 other young men from Fitchburg left for Fort Benning, Georgia to train with the parachute troops. One of his men was Emile's best friend and baseball teammate, Songbird. From there, his training continued at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. While in Darby on March 6, 1943. Sergeant Tingway came home in furlough for 5 days to visit with his parents in August 1943. This will be the last time his parents, brother, and sisters would see him. He returned to Fort Bragg, where he remained for a month before leaving for England. In Europe, he went through additional intensive training with the 101st Airborne Division before the ship Eagles for the Normandy invasion. On June 5, 1944, Emil wrote a letter to his 18-year-old brother, who was a member of the U.S. Navy stationed on Long Island, New York. Acting as older brother, Emil wrote, "I see that you're starting to get around with the girls now." He went on to warn Robert to be careful of the girls because some of them were just neighbor kids. Despite the lightheartedness of his advice, his letter is particularly poignant because it would be the last one he wrote home to his friend. 3 hours before the main beach landings in Normandy, at H hour, Sergeant Tingway and his fellow members of the 101st Airborne began their role in the invasion. Unfortunately, these troops, other than their heavy cannon fire, they were buried in one, causing the enemy to be different from what was originally planned. Many of his fellow paratroopers ended up to 5 miles off target, and some became able to survive the jump. But Emil did survive the landing. However, the next day, on the way to Carrington at Deadman's Corner, Staff Sergeant Milton Way became one of the 16,000 island heroes of Normandy. As American troops moved through the village of Carrington, Sinai Borlow, the young man who went to school with Emil, played ball with Emil, and enlisted with Emil, saw his best friend, Staff Sergeant Emil W. Tingway, get hit with a phosphorus shell and die. On Saturday, June 24th, Emil's parents, Wilfred and Aslan Tingway, were informed by the U.S. Navy, the Army, that their eldest son, Emil Tingway, was the first Fitchburg serviceman to be killed during the invasion battle in France on June 7, 1944, the day after D-Day. Sadly, just 1 year later, they would receive news that their youngest son, Emil's brother, Seaman First Class Robert Tingway, had died at the age of 19 fighting on an island in the Pacific. Mrs. Ezeline Tingway became the Gold Star mother, having lost both her sons, Emil and Robert, in World War II. In a newspaper article written 50 years after D-Day, Emil's best friend, Sinai Borlow, remarked, "Never wanted to visit Normandy because of what happened to Emil." However, he, like the members of the greatest generation, did come here, and he paid his respects to his friend. At this grave, that we stand before now. At the funeral mass held on July 3, 1944, at St. Joseph Church in Fitchburg, Massachusetts, Emil Tingway was honored for fighting bravely on the battlefield and for sacrificing the best years of his life for the service of his country, for which he was awarded the Purple Heart. I am humbled to have had the opportunity to learn about the life and death of Staff Sergeant Emil Tingway. He will forever remain in my heart as a true hero, a silent hero, who sacrificed and transformations to make the world's love.
O ye whose cheek the tear of pity stains, draw near and pay tribute to these honored dead. Here lies the precious husband's dear remains, the first-time father and the generous friend. The committed heart that answered his country's call, the dauntless heart and leader of men, the friend of man on distant shores, a sacrifice for freedom for those unborn. Omri Carl Weathers Jr. was typical of many American youth in his era. He grew up in the 1920s and 30s in Salem, a small community in northwestern Arkansas nestled in the Ozark Mountains. Omri Jr. was the second born of 6 siblings and usually went by his middle name, Carl. His father, Omri Sr., and mother, Lucy, had great hopes for their 2 oldest sons, Don and Carl. Omri Sr. and Lucy modeled good citizenship and service as both were community leaders and actively involved in local politics. However, tragedy soon struck as Don, Carl, and their siblings suffered the loss of their father. Carl was only 15 years old at the time. Don and Carl, as the older sons, had no choice but to face the realities of life. With the help and guidance of their mother, they became the men of the house and took on part-time jobs to help support and care for their 4 younger siblings. All through high school, Carl was known as an all-American kid, who with other boys in the neighborhood threw himself into sports. He was on the high school basketball team and once broke his arm while trying to learn how to pole vault. In every high school picture we found in our research, he is in the center of his peers and teammates smiling. Carl's mother, Lucy, was determined to fulfill her and her husband's dream of giving their boys a priceless gift, a college education. She made many sacrifices to make this possible. A civil servant herself, she saw the possibilities that being in the service could provide for her boys. Accordingly, she encouraged Carl, and he attended the University of Arkansas on an ROTC scholarship. Carl was extremely active and involved in university life. He joined the Razorback Booster Club in the YMCA and eventually ran and served as a class officer. Carl graduated in May of 1941 and immediately entered the United States Army Infantry as a commissioned officer at the rank of 2nd lieutenant and quickly rose to the status of captain. Like countless other American servicemen following the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Carl found himself at the right place at just the right time in history to answer his country's need and call of service during wartime. In 1943, as the tide of the war began to shift in favor of the United States and our allies, military leaders planned an invasion of France to fight Hitler and the Nazis. Carl was deployed overseas with the 2nd Infantry Division, 38th Infantry Regiment, Company K to Ireland for his advanced training. Like other soldiers, he was aware of what serving in combat could mean. While in training nonetheless, Carl met a young Irish girl whom he courted and married. I am sure Carl had high hopes of building a family after the war with his young bride. However, Carl would never live to see the son that resulted from his marriage and was his namesake. On June 7, 1944, D-Day +1, the 2nd Infantry Division went ashore at Omaha Beach. Captain Weathers and his company had been assigned to push inland in an effort to capture the French city of Treviere. As Captain Weathers' company crossed its line of departure, artillery was placed on enemy front lines in support of the advance. Suddenly, an intense German artillery concentration pinned them to the ground. A sergeant who was with Captain Weathers asked him to stay down, but Carl answered that he could not give his commands and leave his men lying flat on the ground. He courageously ran across the entire company front alone towards the enemy line, commanding his men to move forward. Inspired by their leader's gallantry, his men followed his example and began a vigorous assault. Sadly, Captain Weathers was only able to advance with his men a few hundred feet before being struck and killed by an artillery shell. His heroics did not go unnoticed, however. For his calmness and bravery under fire, his personal sacrifice, and his unwavering devotion to duty, Captain Weathers was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Although Carl's sacrifice cut short all of the possibilities for his own future, it helped to create limitless possibilities for those of us gathered here today and millions of others. Let us all bear witness to his sacrifice and to the sacrifice of all of those who surround us in this hallowed ground. Carl fought and died for an ideal that was the genesis of our country, an ideal that he and others fought to preserve at home and on distant shores. The motto of his and my home state, Arkansas, Regnat Populus, the people rule. In a very real sense, Carl's life and sacrifice made our lives possible. Captain Carl Weathers, forever a son of Salem, Arkansas, and of Arkansas more generally, we are proud of you and are proud to salute you today for your life, your service, your courage, and your sacrifice.
December 5th, 1943 is a date that does not hold as much significance for others as much as dates like June 6, 1944, or December 7th, 1941. But it brings on an all-new level of emotions for me. This is the day that Staff Sergeant William E. Davis, Jr. was shot down over Cognac, France, on a return trip to headquarters after a successful bombing run on a German industrial complex. Born originally in New York, Staff Sergeant Davis moved to a small town in Pennsylvania called Conshohocken when he was a boy. One of 9 children to William and Mildred Davis, William Jr. grew up in a small, single-story building with bed sheets for walls. He spent the later end of his teenage years working in an airplane factory, helping assemble different parts. With only 1 year of high school experience, Davis joined the Army Air Corps at the age of 18. After a year of gunner training in the U.S., he was finally shipped off to England, where all of his future missions would be staged. It was obvious to me the minute I saw his enlistment age that Staff Sergeant Davis was a very dedicated patriot and was willing to put his life on the line to protect both his family and his country. Flying over 10 successful missions with a plethora of crews, Davis was awarded 4 medals in his military career, one of which being the Air Medal with 1 oak cluster on the ribbon. On Staff Sergeant Davis's last flight, he took the role of photographer on a B-17 named Old Vassar. Usually a waist gunner, it is believed that William volunteered to occupy this position on this mission for the purpose of gathering valuable intelligence. Through the pictures that I saw at the archives and various lessons, I have learned that intelligence was one of the most important pieces to the orchestration of the D-Day landings, and that without soldiers gathering intelligence like Staff Sergeant Davis, planning the Normandy landings would have been virtually impossible. Through my research of Staff Sergeant William E. Davis, Jr., I feel as though I have a special connection to him, almost as if I've met him before. However, my research did not only provide me with a better connection to Staff Sergeant Davis, it also made me realize that every single death in this war had behind it a very human aspect. Staff Sergeant Davis has made me realize that those millions of numbers are much more than a statistic. They were living, breathing human beings. This realization opened my eyes to what it really means to sacrifice something for what you believe in. Staff Sergeant Davis has made me realize that every single person who served in the military were not only putting their bodies on the line, they were putting quite literally everything they had on the line for the preservation of peace, liberty, and freedom. Rest in peace, William. I know that your sacrifice is not forgotten, nor is it taken for granted.
Some lives are quiet. So quiet it seems that they never existed. I began to realize this when I researched the life of Private Eston A. Baxter. Eston lived on a small family farm in the sleepy town of Crosby, Tennessee. We share a hometown and a common ancestor. His family did not have much money. His father died when Eston was only 17. Eston was forced to grow up prematurely to care for his elderly grandfather, his mother, 2 younger brothers, and a younger cousin. He was no stranger to hard work. To his family's dismay, he was drafted in 1942, and throughout his wartime experience, he wrote countless letters to his family. He wrote to his mama, to his little brother Frank, his little buddy who at age 5 could not even read yet, and to his many girlfriends back home, some of whom did not always write back. He told them of how he was doing and asked if they were well. In one letter, he told of a man getting discharged. "I wish it was me, Mama," he wrote. He once again asked his mother for money to go home on furlough, claiming he would hitchhike if he had to. He always signed his letters, "So answer soon," which only reiterated the fact he longed to return to his small home in the mountains. His last letter was written on June 17, 1944, from somewhere in France, and the next news his family received was a telegram announcing he was killed in action. His little brother remembers the day well, because they all knew what the car in the driveway meant. Originally, he was in the 113th Infantry, providing defense for the eastern seaboard, but Eston was transferred sometime between April and June of 1944 to the 12th Infantry 4th Division, where he was assigned to the 1st Battalion, Company B. The 4th Division landed on Utah Beach on June 6, 1944, as the Allies launched the largest naval force in history to liberate Europe from the Nazi regime.
On June 24th, while trying to capture the port of Cherbourg, he lost his life. The day of his death, his company captured 3 objectives, a German command post, ammunition stores, and 395 prisoners. There were 15 killed on that day. He was awarded the Bronze Star August 17, 1988, for meritorious achievement in ground combat against the armed enemy during World War II. Eston gave the ultimate sacrifice for his country, yet the memory of his life fades with time. His youngest brother was so small when he left for war that he has very little memory of him. His niece only knew that her father encouraged her grandmother to live in there, buried amongst the men he served and died with. While she never knew him personally, she has enjoyed learning about his life along with us. You will not find his name in a history book, nor will you find the names of countless others who have died in the name of war. Today, we honor a soldier buried in the cemetery to keep his memory alive for a little longer, so that his legacy will not be buried with him. To Eston, you have inspired me to push myself a little harder, to make the most of the time that we do have. Life is not always just. When the world needed them most, these were the men who answered the call. Each soldier not only bore the weight of their pack, but the burden of sacrifice. These men are the reason we are standing here today. They've enabled democracy to continue, and we must honor them by constantly seeking to be better for the future. William Faulkner once said, "The past is not dead, it's not even past." This is closely reflected in the world the Normandy invasion made possible. Like Eston, most of the soldiers buried here today led quiet lives, but the impact of their actions echoes loudly and shakes all who listen. Thank you.
Growing up in small, rural Craig, Colorado, daily life didn't have much to offer. However, Norman Foster was always having fun, whether he was attending school dances, playing on the high school football team, or working at his dad's Pontiac dealership, or even taking trips up to Steamboat Springs to visit Fish Creek Falls or the hot springs. He was always having a good time. Out of his graduating class of 43 people, Norman stood out among his peers. He was very close to his family, especially his younger sister Beth. Norman's family never found closure in his death, and it took a great physical and emotional toll on his family. Seeking some small bit of closure, it was Beth who, many years later, finally had a gravestone placed at the Craig Cemetery. Norman Foster was a sharp dresser who loved the feeling of being fresh and clean, something hard to come by in the Army. When Norman came home on furlough in late 1943, his mom asked him what he wanted. He replied that he would like to have his sheets laundered every day while he was home. There's nothing like that feeling of going to bed in clean sheets, and he wanted to remember that. Apart from being very clean, Norman was a class clown. Always cracking jokes, he had the love of everyone he knew. His charming personality led him to befriend people from all walks of life. He was remembered by classmates as being a kind person of high moral character. His athletic skills would have served him well in basic training, where he and his comrades learned to maintain their weapons and to crawl on their elbows and knees. Pleasant evenings were spent at the post exchange, drinking soda pops and enjoying candy. One evening in December, after learning of his assignment to England, Norman and his hometown friend, Stuart Coles, were visiting on the line outside their barracks. Norman said, "Stu, this is a one-way road to death." Stuart was bothered by this and encouraged Norman to be more positive, reminding him to do what they had been taught. It would all be okay. I cannot imagine standing, waiting for my name to be called to ship out to England, where units were preparing for the long-awaited cross-channel invasion. Soon after, Norman would be leaving Fort Knox and ship overseas to join the battle-tested A Company, 70th Tank Battalion. He was assigned as a driver on one of the secret amphibious tanks that, along with B Company, would spearhead the invasion in the first assault wave on Utah Beach. Norman's tank and the other 3 tanks on LCT 593 would never make it ashore. As they prepared to launch their DD tanks, a massive underwater explosion took place, ripping LCT 593 in half,
and hurling all 4 tanks 100 feet into the air. Only one soldier survived the blast. The rest, including Norman Foster, were never seen again. Stuart Coles did not know that a navigational error coupled with an underwater mine would combine to make Norman's premonition come true. Norman was holding on to a death ticket, and departed on that journey 3,000 yards off Utah Beach on the morning of June 6, 1944. Norman is the type of person I would have been friends with. He was kind and funny and had his own unique quirks. He had a future. One he wanted to live out just as I do, and it is unfair that he did not get the chance. I have the greatest respect for Norman and his family and the sacrifices he and others made to preserve our freedom.
Non sibi sed patriae, Latin for not self but country, and the unofficial motto of the United States Navy. Primum non nocere, or first do no harm, the core belief of every person in the medical profession, whether they have taken the Hippocratic Oath or not. Whether he was aware of it or not, Chief Pharmacist Mate Graham Carley Mann lived by both of these sayings. As a sailor, he dedicated his life to serving his country. As a medical officer, he repaired, to the best of his ability, the wounds war had inflicted on his comrades. He was described by his commanding officers as a hard-working and soft-spoken, diligent and intelligent. Somebody you could depend on, a man who would always perform his duty with grace and efficiency. He demonstrated these qualities in the Civilian Conservation Corps, where he worked as a teenager. In the Second World War, he demonstrated them in Guadalcanal and in Iceland. From June 6th to June 9th, 1944, he demonstrated those qualities in Normandy. Graham Mann did not storm the beaches of Normandy. He was stationed on the LST-314, and it was his duty, as well as the duty of every other medical officer on that ship, to convert the landing craft into a floating hospital. He worked tirelessly to tend to the wounds of those who had fought on Utah and on Omaha, treating Allied soldiers and the German prisoners of war alike, and in doing this, saw as much carnage as any of the soldiers fighting on the beaches. On June 9th, a German E-boat sunk the LST-314 as it was making its second journey back to England after offloading cargo to Normandy. When the torpedoes hit, CPHM Mann was working at a station. That day, he and many of his shipmates gave their lives so that others may survive. The memory of Graham was carried on by his parents. The memory of Graham was carried on by his parents. Isabella, the mother who raised 3 children in hard times and lost 2 of them to war. And Henry, the proud father who saw his oldest son carry out his legacy in the Navy. He was remembered by his younger brother, John, who went on to raise his own family after the war, and his devoted wife, Virginia Clare, who accompanied him to his stations from California to Virginia and back again. Now that legacy is carried on by myself, by my teacher, and by everyone present here today. I never met Graham, but I feel that on some level, I do know him. He was the child that grew up in a growing city, a boy who faced the challenges of depression, and a man who witnessed the trials of war. He is someone who deserves to be remembered and thanked for his life of service and devotion. So on behalf of everyone here today, thank you, Graham. Your sacrifice is one that will